"Sir, you need to leave first class right now." The words cut through the cabin so sharply that even the quiet hum of the aircraft seemed to fade for a moment. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. A flight attendant named Nicole Harris stood in the aisle with her arms folded, her expression fixed with the kind of certainty that never pauses to question itself. Across from her sat Malcolm Carter, a tall black man in a plain black t-shirt, dark jeans, and worn sneakers. He looked more like someone returning from a long business trip than a man worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Malcolm glanced up slowly, calm enough to make the tension around him feel even louder. "I believe this is my seat," he said, holding up his boarding pass. Nicole barely looked at it. "That seat is reserved for premium passengers," she replied. "You'll need to move to economy." A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Malcolm checked the boarding pass again as though confirming a fact he already knew. Seat 2A. First class. Paid in full. Assigned under his legal name. Nothing about the document was unclear. Yet Nicole acted as if she had already reached her verdict. "There must be some mistake," Malcolm said. "No," Nicole answered quickly. "The mistake is that you're sitting here." The air inside the cabin felt charged now. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just tense. Like a storm gathering behind closed windows. Malcolm remained seated. He had spent most of his life recognizing moments exactly like this. Different city. Different building. Different faces. Same assumption. Nicole leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound professional while making sure everyone nearby could still hear her. "Sir, if you cooperate, we can avoid creating a scene." The irony hung in the air. Malcolm had not raised his voice. He had not argued. He had not broken a single rule. Yet somehow he was the one being accused of causing trouble. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. A woman near the window paused her music and removed one earbud. Everyone could feel something was wrong. Malcolm looked around the cabin. Plush leather seats. Soft lighting. Polished service. The kind of environment designed to project exclusivity. Yet the atmosphere now felt smaller than the narrow aisle separating him from Nicole. "I'm not creating a scene," Malcolm said quietly. "I'm sitting in the seat I purchased." Nicole's jaw tightened. Last warning. The words landed harder than she intended. Not because they sounded powerful, but because they sounded rehearsed. Malcolm studied her expression for a moment. Then he slowly folded his boarding pass and placed it in his lap. The movement was calm. Deliberate. Almost patient. That patience irritated Nicole more than resistance ever could. Behind her, several passengers began whispering. One pulled out a phone. Another shook his head. The mood inside the cabin was shifting. Nicole could feel it. Malcolm could feel it too. But unlike everyone else, he wasn't surprised. He had walked onto this plane expecting a flight. What he found instead was a test. And before the aircraft ever left the ground, that test had already begun. Malcolm Carter did not look like the image most people expected when they heard the word Chief Executive Officer. There was no tailored suit. No luxury watch catching the cabin lights. No assistant following a few steps behind. He sat alone with a carry-on bag beneath the seat and a calm expression that seemed completely disconnected from the tension surrounding him. That was exactly how he preferred it. For more than 20 years, Malcolm had built one of the largest logistics companies in the United States. His trucks crossed thousands of miles of highways every day. His cargo moved through ports, rail yards, and distribution centers across the country. Yet very few people recognized his face. He liked it that way. Success had taught him something important. The moment people recognized power, they changed. Their voices softened. Their assumptions disappeared. Their respect arrived instantly. Malcolm had always been more interested in how people behaved before they knew who he was. Nicole remained standing beside his seat. Her posture was rigid now. She expected resistance. She expected an argument. Instead she found patience, and patience made her uncomfortable. Around them, passengers continued watching. Some pretended to scroll through their phones while quietly listening to every word. Others openly stared. The cabin no longer felt like a place where strangers minded their own business. It felt like a courtroom waiting for evidence. Malcolm glanced through the oval window beside him. The evening sky above the runway was turning orange as the sun lowered toward the horizon. Ground crews moved steadily below. Fuel trucks rolled past. Everything outside appeared orderly. Inside the cabin, however, something much less predictable was unfolding. Nicole cleared her throat. "Sir, I am trying to help you avoid a problem." Malcolm looked back at her. "By removing me from the seat listed on my boarding pass." The question hung between them. Nicole offered no answer. Instead, she motioned toward the rear of the aircraft. "Economy has available seating." A few rows away, a middle-aged passenger frowned. Another passenger exchanged a glance with his wife. Even people who knew nothing about Malcolm could see the contradiction. A valid ticket had been presented. No explanation had been provided. Yet the pressure continued. Malcolm folded his hands together. He had seen this pattern before. Not once. Not twice. More times than he cared to count. Different industries. Different buildings. Different uniforms. The same assumption hiding underneath. People often believed they could identify who belonged in certain spaces simply by appearance. Malcolm never forgot those moments. He simply learned not to react immediately. Calmness revealed more than anger ever could. Near the front galley, a young flight attendant named Emily Parker watched the situation unfold with growing concern. She had scanned passengers during boarding. She remembered Malcolm's ticket turning green on her device. First class. Confirmed. No issue. No warning. No discrepancy. Emily looked from Malcolm to Nicole and back again. Something was wrong, and she knew it. For now she remained silent. But the expression on her face suggested that silence might not last much longer. Meanwhile Malcolm sat exactly where he was, unshaken, while the pressure around him continued to build one uncomfortable moment at a time. The tension that had been simmering quietly inside the cabin suddenly found a new target. Nicole looked toward the boarding door and lifted a hand. "You can bring them up now," she said. Moments later, an older white couple stepped into first class carrying expensive luggage and the confidence of people accustomed to being welcomed wherever they went. The man smiled as he looked at seat 2A. "Ah, there it is," he said. Nicole immediately returned the smile she had never offered Malcolm. "We are so sorry for the delay, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "We had a seating issue to resolve." The words landed heavily. Malcolm remained seated, but now every nearby passenger understood exactly what was happening. Nicole was not simply questioning his ticket. She was actively trying to replace him. Mrs. Whitmore glanced toward Malcolm. "Is that our seat?" she asked. Nicole nodded. "It will be in just a moment." A ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged looks. The situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Malcolm slowly looked up. "Interesting," he said calmly. "So now we know why my boarding pass suddenly became a problem." Nicole's expression hardened. "Sir, I am asking you one final time to cooperate." Malcolm studied her face. The certainty was still there, but cracks were beginning to appear around the edges. People were watching. People were listening. And worst of all for Nicole, people were starting to think for themselves. Across the aisle, a businessman closed his laptop. "Does he not have a valid ticket?" he asked. Nicole answered quickly. "This is an internal matter, sir." The businessman frowned. "That is not what I asked." Silence followed. It was only a few seconds long, but it felt much longer. Emily Parker stood near the galley, clutching her tablet. She had checked the passenger manifest twice already. Malcolm Carter remained listed in seat 2A. Confirmed. Paid. Cleared. There was no system error. No duplicate reservation. No explanation that justified what was happening. Her stomach tightened. She was new, but she was not blind. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps there has been some misunderstanding, he offered. Nicole immediately shook her head. No misunderstanding. Malcolm noticed the reaction. Unlike Nicole, the couple appeared uneasy. They had expected a premium travel experience, not front-row seats to an escalating controversy. Several rows behind them, a passenger quietly raised a phone and began recording. Then another did the same. The atmosphere inside the aircraft changed again. The cabin no longer felt controlled. It felt divided. On one side stood authority. On the other stood common sense. Malcolm folded his hands and looked out the window once more. The aircraft still had not pushed back from the gate. The evening sky had darkened slightly, casting long shadows across the runway. Everything appeared calm outside. Inside, however, pressure continued building with every passing minute. Nicole took a breath and straightened her uniform. "Sir," she said, her voice sharper now, "you are preventing this flight from departing on time." Malcolm turned back toward her. His expression never changed. "No," he replied quietly. "I think the person preventing this flight from departing is the one trying to remove a passenger from the seat he legally purchased." The silence that followed Malcolm's response spread through the cabin like a crack moving across glass. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The facts were beginning to speak for themselves. Nicole looked around and immediately noticed something she did not like. The passengers were no longer looking at Malcolm with suspicion. They were looking at her. Emily Parker felt her pulse quicken. She stared at the passenger manifest on her tablet one more time. The information had not changed. Malcolm Carter. Seat 2A. First class. Confirmed. Every detail matched. For several minutes she had convinced herself that a senior crew member must know something she did not. Now that explanation was falling apart. Across the aisle, a woman named Sarah Mitchell lowered her phone and spoke up. "I watched him board," she said. "He showed his ticket. Everything seemed normal." Another passenger nodded. "I saw the same thing." The comments were simple, but they carried weight. Witnesses were beginning to emerge. Nicole forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your concern, but this is an operational matter." The words sounded polished. They also sounded increasingly hollow. Sarah frowned. An operational matter would have an explanation. Several nearby passengers quietly agreed. Mr. Whitmore shifted in place again. His confidence from earlier had disappeared. "Perhaps we should verify the reservation before asking anyone to move," he suggested. Even his wife nodded. Neither of them looked comfortable occupying a seat that clearly belonged to someone else. Nicole's expression tightened. The situation was slipping beyond her control. Near the rear of first class, a college student named Jason Reed continued recording on his phone. He had started filming only because something felt strange. Now he could not stop. "This does not make sense," he whispered. "Why is nobody checking the actual record?" Emily heard the comment. More importantly, she realized he was right. The answer was already sitting in her hands. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. "Nicole," she said carefully. "I checked the manifest again." Every conversation stopped. Nicole turned immediately. "And?" Emily swallowed. "Seat 2A is assigned to Mr. Carter." The cabin became perfectly still. The statement was not emotional. It was not dramatic. It was simply true. Yet truth has a way of changing the temperature of a room. Nicole stared at her. "You are mistaken." Emily shook her head. "I checked twice." The young flight attendant's voice trembled slightly, but she continued. "There is no conflict in the reservation system." Sarah looked at Malcolm, then back at Emily. "So he belongs here?" Emily nodded slowly. "According to the system, yes." A wave of murmurs rolled through the cabin. People who had remained silent until now began exchanging looks. The businessman across the aisle leaned back in his seat. That should settle it. But it did not. Nicole stood frozen for a moment, caught between evidence and pride. Malcolm watched everything unfold without changing expression. He had not asked anyone to defend him. He had not argued. He had simply remained where he belonged. And now, one by one, the witnesses were beginning to see exactly what he had seen from the very beginning. Emily's words should have ended the dispute. They should have settled everything. The reservation was confirmed. The seat belonged to Malcolm. The facts were no longer in question. Yet Nicole remained standing in the aisle, unwilling to surrender the story she had already decided to believe. The tension inside the cabin became almost tangible. It sat between the seats like invisible weight pressing down on everyone. Malcolm noticed the silence spreading through first class. He had experienced this moment before. The moment when people realized something unfair was happening but were still deciding whether to acknowledge it. It reminded him of another airport many years earlier. Malcolm was 24 years old then, fresh out of graduate school and carrying everything he owned in a single travel bag. He had saved for months to purchase a ticket for an important business conference in Dallas. The flight represented opportunity. A chance to meet investors. A chance to be taken seriously. A chance to build a future that existed only in notebooks and late-night plans. At the gate, an airline employee looked at his ticket, then looked at him, then looked at the ticket again. The woman frowned as if the document and the person holding it did not belong together. She questioned him repeatedly while other passengers walked by without hesitation. Malcolm still remembered standing there while strangers stared. He remembered the feeling of having to prove something nobody else was asked to prove. He remembered how small the terminal suddenly felt. Most of all, he remembered promising himself that if success ever came, he would never forget that moment. The memory faded as Malcolm returned to the present. The cabin lights reflected softly against the windows. The same feeling lingered after all these years. Different airport. Different uniform. Same assumption. Nicole folded her arms. "The flight cannot remain delayed forever," she said. Her voice sounded less confident now. Malcolm noticed it immediately. Confidence usually grows stronger when supported by facts. Hers was doing the opposite. Sarah Mitchell shook her head. "The delay is not his fault." Several passengers quietly agreed. Even Mr. Whitmore appeared uncomfortable. "If the reservation is confirmed," he said carefully, "perhaps we should allow the gentleman to remain in his assigned seat." Nicole did not respond. Instead, she looked toward the front of the aircraft as though searching for support that was no longer there. Emily stood her ground. The young flight attendant had crossed an invisible line the moment she spoke the truth. There was no going back now. Jason Reed continued recording from his seat. Other passengers were doing the same. Nobody announced it. Nobody coordinated it. The witnesses had simply awakened. Malcolm sat quietly in the center of it all. His calmness seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Yet that calmness came from experience. He knew something the rest of the cabin did not. He knew that people reveal their character when they believe there will be no consequences. And as the pressure continued building around Nicole, Malcolm realized the most revealing part of the evening had only just begun. The atmosphere inside first class had changed completely. What began as a simple disagreement over a seat now felt like something much larger. The facts were clear. The witnesses were speaking. Yet Nicole continued standing in the aisle as though refusing to acknowledge reality could somehow change it. Malcolm looked at the cabin around him. Phones were visible now. Conversations had quieted. Every eye seemed focused on the same question. Why was this still happening? He reached calmly into his pocket and removed his phone. The movement was so ordinary that most people barely noticed it. Nicole did. Her eyes narrowed immediately. "Sir, what are you doing?" Malcolm unlocked the screen. "Sending a message." "To whom?" she asked. Malcolm glanced up. "Someone who needs to know what is happening." The answer only frustrated her more. She expected confrontation. She expected anger. Instead, she was receiving patience and certainty. Malcolm typed a short message. Just 2 words. "Bring him." Then he pressed send. No explanation. No dramatic speech. No threats. The message disappeared into the digital world as quietly as it had arrived. Nicole folded her arms again. "If you think that changes anything, you are mistaken." Malcolm slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Maybe." The response was calm enough to unsettle her further. Across the aisle, Sarah Mitchell watched carefully. "Who did you send that to?" she asked. Malcolm offered a small smile. "An old friend." The answer created more questions than it solved. Emily noticed something else. Malcolm did not look worried. He did not look nervous. He looked patient. Almost as if he knew exactly how the evening would end. Several rows away, Jason Reed lowered his phone briefly. "This guy knows something," he whispered. A businessman nearby nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." Near the boarding door, another crew member entered and quietly spoke with Nicole. Her expression changed for only a second before she regained control. But Malcolm noticed. Years of negotiations had taught him how to recognize panic hiding behind professionalism. The aircraft still sat at the gate. Outside, service vehicles moved beneath the fading evening light. Inside, time seemed suspended. Then Malcolm's phone vibrated once. He glanced at the screen. A reply had arrived. "On my way." Malcolm read the message and locked the phone again. Nothing about his expression changed, but a small sense of certainty settled over him. Nicole noticed the vibration. "Bad news?" she asked sarcastically. Malcolm looked directly at her. "Actually, quite the opposite." The answer lingered in the air. Nobody knew what it meant. Not Sarah. Not Emily. Not Jason. Certainly not Nicole. Yet something about the confidence in Malcolm's voice made the entire cabin pause. It felt like the moment before a curtain rises. The moment before everyone realizes they have been watching only half of the story. And somewhere beyond the aircraft door, someone was already moving toward the gate. The first sign that something had changed came from outside the aircraft. Through the cabin windows, several passengers noticed unusual activity near the gate. Airport staff who had been moving casually only moments earlier suddenly appeared focused. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Even Nicole glanced toward the boarding door. A moment later, the door opened again. The cabin fell quiet. A tall man with silver hair stepped onto the aircraft accompanied by 2 senior airport executives. He was dressed simply, but there was nothing ordinary about the reaction he received. Flight attendants immediately straightened. Ground supervisors stepped aside. The atmosphere shifted so quickly it felt as if the entire aircraft had taken a breath at the same time. Emily recognized him instantly. Her eyes widened. Sarah Mitchell looked confused. Jason Reed lowered his phone for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. The newcomer walked calmly down the aisle. Every step seemed deliberate. Every eye followed him. Nicole's confidence vanished so quickly it was almost visible. "Mr. Sterling," she said, forcing a smile. Arthur Sterling, the owner of one of the largest airline groups in America, barely acknowledged her greeting. Instead, his attention remained fixed on a single person seated in first class. Malcolm Carter. The cabin became perfectly silent. Arthur stopped beside seat 2A and looked down at Malcolm. Then something happened that nobody expected. Arthur smiled. Not the polite smile of a businessman greeting a customer. The smile of someone greeting an equal. "Sorry I am late, Malcolm," he said. Traffic at the terminal was worse than usual. A stunned silence swept through the cabin. Sarah blinked. Jason stared. Emily covered her mouth. Nicole looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Malcolm stood slowly and shook Arthur's hand. "You made it," he replied. Arthur nodded. "The moment I received your message." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the soft sounds of the aircraft seemed distant now. Nicole finally found her voice. "You know each other?" The question sounded small. Arthur turned toward her. "Know each other?" He glanced back at Malcolm and smiled again. "We have been business partners for years." The words landed like thunder. Several passengers exchanged shocked looks. Mr. Whitmore sat frozen in his seat. Emily stared at Malcolm as if seeing him for the first time. Arthur continued. "In fact, Malcolm's company owns a significant stake in the logistics division that helps support this airline's operations." Nicole's face drained of color. Malcolm remained calm. The same calm he had shown from the beginning. The same calm that now seemed far more powerful than anyone had realized. Arthur looked around the cabin. "Can someone explain why my business partner was being removed from the seat he legally purchased?" Nobody answered. The silence felt enormous. Then Malcolm finally spoke. His voice was steady and controlled. "Arthur, they told me I did not belong in first class." He paused and looked around the cabin. Every passenger was listening. Every witness was watching. What they never bothered to learn, Malcolm said quietly, was that the man they were trying to remove helps own the very company they were trying to impress. Nobody rushed to answer Arthur's question. The silence spreading through first class felt heavier than any explanation. Nicole stood motionless in the aisle, her earlier certainty completely gone. For the first time that evening, she looked unsure of what to say. Arthur Sterling slowly turned toward Emily. "You were checking the manifest?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Yes, sir." "And what did it show?" Arthur continued. Emily took a breath. Mr. Carter was assigned to seat 2A. The reservation was valid the entire time. Arthur nodded once. The simple confirmation carried more weight than 100 arguments. He looked toward the passengers who had witnessed everything. Several nodded in agreement. Others quietly raised their phones again. The facts had become impossible to dispute. Mr. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably before standing from the seat that had never belonged to him. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology. I should have questioned this sooner." Malcolm offered a small nod. "Thank you." There was no anger in his voice. No satisfaction. Only calm. That calmness somehow made the moment even more powerful. Arthur looked back toward Nicole. "Did you verify the reservation before attempting to move him?" Nicole opened her mouth, then stopped. The answer was obvious. Arthur did not need a response. He could see it in her expression. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged looks. The story they had been watching unfold suddenly made sense. It had never been about a reservation. It had never been about a seat. It had been about assumptions. Arthur folded his hands in front of him. "Do you know what concerns me most?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered. "It is not that a mistake was made. Mistakes happen." His eyes moved across the cabin. "What concerns me is that multiple opportunities were given to correct that mistake, and each one was ignored." The words landed with remarkable force because they were delivered so calmly. Emily lowered her eyes. Sarah Mitchell nodded slowly. Even Jason stopped recording for a moment as he listened. Arthur continued. A passenger presented a valid ticket. Witnesses raised concerns. A crew member confirmed the manifest. Yet the pressure continued. Nicole stared at the floor. The confidence that had filled her voice earlier had disappeared entirely. Malcolm watched quietly. He had spent years building companies and negotiating billion-dollar contracts. He understood something many people never learned. Real accountability rarely arrives with shouting. It arrives with facts. Arthur reached into his jacket and removed his phone. A brief message appeared on the screen. He read it and nodded. Then he slipped the device away. "Corporate leadership is already reviewing tonight's incident," he said. "The documentation, passenger statements, and flight records will all be examined." A wave of whispers moved through the cabin. Nobody seemed surprised. The process had already begun. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real. Arthur then turned toward Malcolm. "I am sorry this happened." Malcolm looked around the cabin before answering. "The problem is bigger than me." Arthur nodded immediately. He understood exactly what Malcolm meant. And judging by the expressions throughout first class, everyone else was beginning to understand it too. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The cabin that had been filled with tension now felt strangely different. The conflict was over, but the lesson remained. Arthur Sterling looked around first class and saw something he rarely witnessed in business meetings or boardrooms. Reflection. People were thinking about what they had just seen. Not a disagreement about a seat. Not a delay before departure. Something deeper. Malcolm remained standing beside seat 2A. The same seat he had occupied from the beginning. The same seat he had never needed to defend with anger. Sarah Mitchell finally broke the silence. "I think a lot of us learned something tonight." Several passengers nodded. Jason Reed lowered his phone completely. The recording no longer mattered as much as the moment itself. Emily stood quietly near the galley. She had spoken up when it mattered, and Malcolm noticed. He walked toward her and offered a small smile. "Thank you for telling the truth." Emily looked surprised. "I was just doing my job." Malcolm nodded. "That is exactly why it mattered." The young flight attendant smiled for the first time that evening. Across the cabin, Mr. Whitmore extended his hand. Malcolm shook it without hesitation. There was no bitterness in the gesture. No need for it. Respect had finally replaced assumption. Arthur watched the exchange and seemed satisfied. Then he turned toward the passengers. "Companies spend millions talking about values," he said. "But values only mean something when they are tested." The cabin remained silent as he continued. Tonight was not about status. It was not about titles. It was not about ownership. It was about whether someone would be treated fairly before those things became known. His words settled over the room like a final verdict. Nobody disagreed. Malcolm looked out the window one last time. The runway light stretched into the distance beneath the darkening sky. Everything outside appeared calm again. Inside, something had changed. Not just for him. For everyone who had witnessed the evening unfold. Arthur placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "Ready to fly?" he asked. Malcolm smiled. "I have been ready the entire time." A few passengers laughed softly. The tension that had dominated the cabin finally disappeared. Crew members resumed their duties. Luggage compartments closed. Preparations for departure continued. Yet the memory of what happened would remain long after the aircraft reached its destination. As Malcolm settled back into seat 2A, he glanced around the cabin one final time. The passengers who had spoken up. The witnesses who had paid attention. The people who chose fairness over convenience. They reminded him why progress was possible. The aircraft door closed. The cabin light softened. And as the plane prepared to leave the gate, Malcolm reflected on a truth he had learned many years earlier. Respect should never depend on a job title. It should never depend on a bank account. It should never depend on whether someone owns a company or simply buys a ticket. Because the real test of character is how people treat someone when they believe that person has no power at all. Malcolm had not raised his voice that night. He had not demanded special treatment. He had simply remained where he belonged. And in the end, that quiet confidence spoke louder than anything else in the cabin ever could.